All right, thanks everybody for coming. Our story is going to be about migrating from GitHub Enterprise Server to GitHub Cloud. We got a lot of advantages for doing this, but these migrations are never as simple as they seem, so we'll be talking through that as we go through. We're going to do a few introductions. We're going to talk about the secrets for successful migration, touch on dev experience and why that matters. We'll get into the details of how we completed this migration. We'll go through a timeline and some tools you can use, and then we'll close with any questions. So if you do have questions, there's microphones in the back that we'll be listening to at the end. All right, introduction-wise, my name is Mark. I am in the Boston area. I've been an engineering effectiveness and platform engineering leader for a good amount of time now. Enjoying the region, being a dad, and also being a gamer. Richard?
Hi, I'm Richard Billington McGuire. I live in Arlington, Virginia with my family. And I'm a tech versatilist. I do a little bit of everything. I've been in the industry for over 30 years, and I'm just happy to be here and talk to you guys today. Sam?
Hey everybody, I'm Sam. I'm a senior software engineer at Wayfair, where I work on the platforms team, working on our cloud infrastructure, our developer experience, and a number of other things. I share a lot of the interests of these guys outside of work between gaming and cycling and stuff like that, so very happy to be here.
Yeah, let's get into it. Okay, so at Wayfair, we had 15,000 repositories that we needed to migrate from a self-hosted instance into the cloud, 10,000 of which were active, about 5,000 archived. These repositories covered everything at Wayfair, from our primary website to our supplier-facing or logistics-facing internal business. If it ran with code, it lived in one of these repos. So all of our most business-critical functions happened here. So how did we successfully migrate? The two keys, first, prepare well. So making sure that we had a plan, making sure that we understood where the problem areas were gonna be, what was hard, what was easy, that kind of thing. And then the second was not taking no for an answer. Teams always get this feeling of this is gonna be super risky, failure's around the corner, and they're always gonna wanna spend just one more day getting ready. You know, one more day, one more week, whatever. And the answer is you'll never be ready if you allow that to continue. There's always another thing you could do to feel just a little bit safer about it. So we'll get into, at least not forever, but the key was not taking no for an answer. We are gonna do this migration. So preparing well. Stakeholder engagement was key. Understanding, again, the stakeholders that were involved. Now, sometimes this was the developers who owned the repository and were working on this code. Other times it was knowing the business functions that were gonna put high demands and high churn on particular areas versus not. What code was gonna need to change a whole bunch and what was relatively static. That affects the timeline and how easy things were to move. We also did a thorough assessment. In addition to code, what kind of integrations did we have with GitHub? What things were calling GitHub? What things were we calling from GitHub as part of our workflows and our pipelines, things like that. And lastly, we broke it into a phased approach, small stages. So we started with less critical repos, in fact, our archived repos. Then we tried some really hard stuff, and then we worked through the middle. A big bang approach where everybody goes to sleep, you know, on Friday, and they come back to work on Monday and it's all done, is a bad idea. There were things that we found as we did some of these phases, and being able to pivot, adjust, and adapt was key. So breaking it into small chunks that we moved through in sequence was important. So, don't take no for an answer was the second big piece. Overcoming change resistance is huge. Again, it's not that people are resistant to the idea of the migration, it's just that that feeling of unsafe means that they always want to take a bit longer to feel safe. There's always another thing that they could do to just be a little bit more sure, right? Wait for after this release. Don't do it while we're testing, blah, blah, blah. In order to give people confidence, the second important thing was giving them good rollback plans and being able to demonstrate that, right? In the case of a failed migration, if something doesn't work, showing that we could instantly revert to the other repo on the originating side was very important. That gave people a lot of sense of comfort that, like, okay, we can take a little bit more risk with this. So it's upping their risk appetite. We had data-driven transparency, tracking tools to provide visibility into the migration, This built trust because they could see what had been done, what would be done, and when their particular things were going to be done. And that proven success. Again, we started with archived repos because those had very low care value. Then we did all of our internal stuff first, and being able to prove that this process works, that everything migrates, the history comes over, the issues come over, that helped build a lot of trust with our users as well. The dev experience, though, matters a lot. One of the things that we were very keen to do in this migration was not have to push a lot of work onto our development teams. If we were constantly saying, hey, you need to do this, you need to make ready, you need to take care of that, we knew we would struggle because that would be in competition with everything else our dev teams have to do. They're not sitting idle. So we took a user-centric approach of thinking, what would the experience be like for the dev teams that own the code? What does their journey from old to new look like? We scripted as much as we possibly could, and Richard's gonna get into some of the details of that in a minute. And those scripts allowed us to put all of the work on our platform teams of how are we going to manage edge cases, how are we gonna do the migration. And last, we had a migration guide. This was really useful in helping people understand the process that was gonna happen, and also, we could update it in real time. So as we encountered some of those early trouble points and we figured out a way to fix them, we would add it to the migration guide so that people could stay current with how this process was going and would go. So the key of the user-centric approach was easy button. We wanted devs, even if we weren't gonna have the whole thing move over a weekend, we still wanted for any individual repo for a dev to be comfortable saying, hey, I went home on GitHub Enterprise, I came back to work on GitHub Cloud, and everything just worked. It was super easy. So those scripted interactions were really of two flavors. Automated scripts that enable us to take care of critical system integrations required for the migration, and then pre-migration preparation. So one of the things that we would do is have a PR that would be in the repo that just needed to be executed post-migration to do the final cleanup. And so that was sitting there waiting for them already, and that helped a lot. Again, Richard's gonna get into some of the details here. And on the migration guide, the key there was the ongoing updates. So I talked a little bit about this, but the idea that we would have this journal/document of the process built a lot of trust. So for how we completed the migration, I'm gonna hand the time over to Richard.
Great. So I'm going to talk about what we did and what made this successful. The most important thing that we did was limiting the changes to the essentials. You can't boil the ocean when you're doing something like this. And like Mark said, trying to do it all in a big bang approach in one day would be very risky. So we used the GitHub Enterprise importer to do the vast bulk of the migrations. And that works well to do a high fidelity migration where you preserve not only the code history, but also issues and pull requests and repository configurations. That really helps. It doesn't cover everything though. It doesn't deal with reestablishing webhooks or app permissions or user permissions or team permissions. So those scripts were essential in working around those limitations. The next thing we did is limiting the scope of change. This also goes back to having a big bang be really risky. So in order to limit the amount of change that we did, we kept the same basic structure of teams and organizations, and we had to add a reverse proxy in order for systems that are behind the corporate firewalls so that GitHub.com could talk to them. Sam's gonna talk a little more about that in a minute. We had to understand the key integrations that made things go. So continuous integration, continuous delivery, infrastructure as code. So dealing with concerns such as Terraform, CI/CD systems such as Jenkins and BuildKite, these all had to work together. Because if there was a big break and all of a sudden the Kubernetes clusters couldn't operate, we were going to have a bad day. The last thing about limiting changes to essentials is testing extensively in a sandbox. So the toolkit that we were using with GitHub Enterprise Importer or the alternative, the ECI toolkit. That allowed us to do a copy style migration where we could get a high fidelity copy of the repositories and stage them into a sandbox area before we moved them into their final organizations. And because we were moving towards GitHub Enterprise Cloud with enterprise managed users, we can't just transfer a repository the same way you can between two different GitHub organizations that are not an enterprise managed user organization at enterprise. So by doing these dry run migrations, we were able to learn from the experience and make sure that we knew what the problems were going to be well in advance of the live migrations. I'm going to hand this over to Sam to talk about the challenges that we had to overcome.
Thanks, Richard. So naturally, there were a number of challenges, and this wasn't all super easy to complete. Primarily, some of our biggest challenges were, first, that we were migrating from a self-hosted GitHub instance to GitHub hosted in the cloud. This meant that all of our webhooks and other automated workflows initiated by GitHub now had to transit the public internet to reach our backend services. We had to find a way to secure this and make sure that we were not exposing ourselves to a security risk. Next, as Richard alluded to, we had hundreds of mission-critical repos that we were moving. This wasn't simply Python packages or other services, but also included dozens of repos holding Terraform infrastructure as code configuration, monolithic applications used by dozens of teams across our company, and other large repositories that would take days to migrate individually. And finally, we were moving 10,000 repos, as Mark said earlier. This is a massive number, and all of these repos needed slight adjustments. Things like tweaking the host names they were using, or updating usernames, or other things that had changed with the migration. We needed a way to be able to make these changes automatically and easily for developers so that we weren't asking people to fix their stuff that we had broken along the way in the migration. To dive more deeply into our first problem that we outlined with security, we had a major challenge where we're moving from our GitHub instance hosted at Wayfair to the GitHub instance hosted on the cloud. This meant that the webhook requests and other requests coming from GitHub now had to transit the public internet before they'd reached our backend services. To solve this problem, we implemented a proxy that allowed us to simply update webhooks and other integrations to use this proxy to travel back to Wayfair safely. A key ingredient to this, and the sort of elegant implementation of how we had this be successful, was using HMAC validation to ensure that the requests we were receiving matched the request that was sent exactly from github.com. This is just one simple example, or maybe a complex example, of a solution we used along the way for the migration. I'm going to hand it back to Richard to talk about some other keys to success that we used during this migration.
So, more things that really helped us make this a success: tracking every repository migration. So, we built this repository tracking spreadsheet. And you know that it's always a little dicey using a spreadsheet as a database. It's an anti-pattern in many ways. But the whole spreadsheet only got screwed up once, and you can guess who screwed it up the worst, okay? But you can revert and fix it. So we tracked every repository in this spreadsheet. And we assigned migration group numbers. So there's 10,000 repositories to migrate. So the range of our migration groups went from 1 to 100,000. So we could interleave them and renumber them, kind of like if any of you programmed in BASIC, 10 print hello world, 20 go to 10, you can have a line 15 that does something else. And we let people modify these migration groups and give us feedback on, like, hey, is this really critical? Is this something we should do in bulk? And if they said, no, don't do it in bulk, our stuff is special, we paid attention to that and we created separate issues in order to track this. So we let people opt out initially this way. They're like, no, you can't do us in bulk migration. We are special snowflakes and you have to make sure that we don't melt. So we worked it out with everyone, okay? And we honored their requests to treat their stuff specially. And we worked on the hard stuff first. Supporting rollbacks, but fixed forward by default. We did have a rollback plan. Given that we were using a copy style migration, the rollback was relatively straightforward in most cases if we had to do it. We could just unarchive the repo that we'd migrated and make sure that any changes that had been made in the migrated repository got filtered back if that was the appropriate thing. But most of the time we didn't do that. We only had a handful of times when we executed a rollback for the 15,000 repositories, including the 10,000 active ones. Our main strategy was to fix forward by default. So if someone found a problem and it wasn't going to cause an incident of a certain priority that meant a loss of funds or an interruption in service, we could just fix forward. And that's what we did most of the time. And there wasn't that much fixing forward we had to do once we reached a certain point in the migration. The other thing is focusing on the most critical repositories. The customer-facing systems, such as the public website, the infrastructure and security systems, such as those that hooked up to Terraform Enterprise, these things got the most attention. And also the build-kite CI/CD repositories. So we had to migrate a certain amount of these things first to have the infrastructure in place, especially when there were cross-repository references. So once those things were in place and they were tested, it unlocked a lot of the work. I worked with Sam really extensively on getting the Terraform Enterprise setup worked out so that the hundreds of repositories that used the particular path for getting that going work correctly. So that let us migrate with confidence. As far as the migration timeline goes, we started an assessment in August of last year, had a couple months where we planned and got the teams going, did the basic configuration of the organization, and then we started on migration scripting and dry runs. And we did this from November through January. And there was a break for the holidays and the peak retail season because Wayfair is in e-commerce. So running the business takes priority during the week of Black Friday and through Christmas. So some of our activities slowed down. But we picked it up again in January, and by the end of January, we had 2% of the repos migrated, and we were able to really ramp it up and then start moving in bulk in March and finish things in April. You can see a chart here of the repositories that are remaining. So, over the 27 weeks or 28 weeks where we were working, most of the time, we didn't have any repositories migrated over. But during that last 8 weeks, we migrated 98% of the repositories because we'd automated, we'd scripted, we'd gotten things down to the point where it was routine, and we just had to deal with some big and difficult ones towards the end. The velocity chart here shows that, where if you see that there's a kind of a peak where we were hitting 600 repositories a day migrated at the peak. And that was after we'd migrated the archived repositories and started doing the full-blown bulk migrations. Things slowed down towards the end because we were focusing on those large and critical repositories, the ones that took the most effort, the ones where we had a whole week to migrate the most difficult repository of all, and had to do some custom scripting to make that work. But it all worked out in the end, and every repository ended up getting migrated. I'm going to hand this back over to Mark to talk about some metrics.
Yeah, so how did this work out for us? Obviously, a lot of work went into this. We spent a lot of time preparing, and then we pushed through pretty hard when it came to actually doing the migrations. What we found is we are saving $150,000 a year. So we were paying a lot of cloud hosting costs to self-host GitHub that we were able to offset. Now we actually dropped those hosting costs by about $200K, $50K of network we picked up in costs, so the net was $150K of savings. But that only tells part of the story. What was really exciting is that we opened the door to a lot of GitHub features that would have been very painful and hard to implement in our own space. Actions, better access to Copilot, workspaces, GAS, for instance, GitHub Advanced Security. And then also, we offset all of the toil of maintaining the GitHub server ourselves. Now that's GitHub's problem, and thank you very much to the GitHubbers in the room for doing that. So that freed up a lot of our time to go after other things, to make those improvements to our CI/CD systems, to go after better sec-ing integrations. We're using that time well, and so that's been a big advantage that isn't accounted for in this number. And we're excited to say that all of the tools that we developed in combination with Modus that were used to do this work, we are going to open source. So now they are available to all of you. And Modus is going to be our maintainer, so I'll let Richard talk about that a little bit.
Right, so I think I forgot to mention in the beginning that I'm from Modus Create, and we're a GitHub partner. And as part of our outreach to the world, we have an open source program office called Twig, which is why the URL is the way it is here. And this migration tooling is available right now. It is now a public repository. And the tooling that we have is the basic migration toolkit that handles the staging of repositories using GitHub Enterprise Importer, and also ECI in the case where that's necessary. And it does more than just what GitHub Enterprise Importer does. So it deals with Git LFS. So if you have large files, that's not something that's migrated over with GEI by itself. You have to do some extra stuff. Deals with setting permissions with teams, and dealing with archiving the repositories that are on the source side, labeling things so that they show as having been migrated. So if someone goes to the source and they see the labeled topic, it shows like, hey, this has been migrated. It also deals with migrating the GitHub app memberships for the repositories, and also has a way of dealing with the webhooks. Now, is this toolkit going to be perfectly suited to anyone else's migration as is? Well, unless you had an environment that's perfectly like Wayfair's, probably not. But it's the sort of thing that we've already been able to reuse and adapt in follow-up migrations. The software is MIT licensed, so it is a permissive open source license, and we are going to maintain it going forward. So any questions, comments, complaints, go to us and not to Wayfair. And in conclusion, I'm going to hand this back over to Mark.
All right, great. So yeah, to wrap up, we had a big migration, and people were nervous and scared about it. We did all the prep work that we needed to do. We lined everything up. We made sure that we had tested and proven it out, and then we were able to execute extremely quickly. And to me, my favorite part is the last slide there, where we are open sourcing these tools. They may not be a perfect fit, as Richard said, but they are definitely going to be a kickstart if you need to go on the same journey. We were able to get to GitHub Cloud with EMU integration, which brought us a whole ton of benefits, lowered TCO, new features, like I said. The preparation and planning paid off, and we controlled disruption by limiting the scope of changes, so we weren't going to try, we were doing a direct port of everything, and that we're going to go regardless. We're going to fail forward when we need to. All of that leaning forward into the migration is going to happen, and we're going to do it. Helped us overcome a lot of change resistance and bring folks along. To me, the greatest reward, though, was the comments that I heard from some of our engineers who said, I don't know how this was so easy. I went to sleep on one system, I woke up on the next. Migrations are not this easy. How did this go so smoothly? And a genuine sense of puzzlement. That was the best reward I took from all of our hard work. So at that point, thank you very much.